The quiet inside Le Cygne Noir, the most expensive restaurant in this city, was never accidental. Silence there was curated. Crystal glasses chimed softly. Silverware touched porcelain like whispers. Low jazz floated through the room like perfume. It was the kind of place where people spoke carefully, laughed politely, and pretended power was gentle. But tonight the silence felt different. Amie. The kind of silence that happens when something dangerous enters a room. The maitre d' had felt it first. The moment the doors opened. The moment Thomas Virelli stepped inside. Half the city owed him money. The other half owed him fear. Newspapers called him a shipping magnate. The streets called him something else. A king who ruled shadows. He walked through the restaurant without hurry, his dark coat falling perfectly around his shoulders. 4 men followed him, large enough to block doorways with their bodies. But what made the entire restaurant freeze wasn't the bodyguards. It was the baby in his arms. The child was crying. Not softly. Not politely. The baby was screaming. A sharp, desperate sound that sliced through the polished room like broken glass. Guests stared at their plates. No one dared react. Even the musicians stopped playing. Thomas stood beside the center table, his jaw tight, trying awkwardly to rock the child. The movement looked unnatural. Like a soldier attempting ballet. Why won't he stop? Thomas muttered. One of the guards shifted uncomfortably. Maybe he is hungry, boss. I fed him, Thomas snapped. The baby screamed louder. Red vase. Tiny fists clenching the fabric of Thomas's expensive suit. The child arched backward in panic. Thomas tried again to bounce him. It didn't work. If anything, the crying grew sharper. A woman at a nearby table flinched and dropped her fork. The sound of metal hitting the floor echoed like a gunshot. Thomas's eyes lifted. The room froze. No one moved. No one breathed. Except the baby. Still crying. Still terrified. Across the dining room, behind a service station near the kitchen doors, Catherine Hill watched the scene unfold. Her feet hurt. Her uniform apron was stained with wine and sauce. She had been working since noon. Another double shift. Her landlord had texted that morning. Rent overdue. Her younger brother's rehab clinic had called twice. Payment required. Catherine rubbed her tired eyes. Then she looked at the baby again. Something about the cry felt familiar. Not hunger. Not pain. Fear. Overstimulation. She had heard it before. Years ago. Back when she volunteered at a shelter nursery during college. A cry that meant the child's nervous system was overwhelmed. Too much light. Too many sounds. Too much tension from the adults around him. The baby twisted again, gasping between screams. Catherine frowned. The father's grip was stiff. Rigid. Protective, but wrong. She glanced around the room. No one moved. No one helped. Because the father holding the baby was Thomas Virelli. And men like Thomas were not approached. Not interrupted. Not corrected. Catherine took a slow breath. Then she grabbed a clean linen napkin and stepped away from the service station. Catherine, another waitress whispered urgently. Don't. The maitre d' looked horrified. You will lose your job. Catherine kept walking. Her heart pounded against her ribs. But the baby cried again. And that sound pushed her forward. A bodyguard stepped in front of her before she reached the table. His hand lifted slightly. Stop. His voice was calm but firm. Staff stays back. Catherine didn't look at him. She looked at Thomas. Up close he looked even more intimidating. Sharp features. Cold eyes. A man used to command. What do you want? Thomas asked quietly. His voice carried a dangerous calm. Catherine swallowed. He isn't hungry. The bodyguard stiffened. Thomas blinked. What? Catherine nodded gently toward the child. He's overwhelmed. The room seemed to shrink. You're telling me, Thomas said slowly, you understand my son better than I do. Catherine met his gaze. Not boldly. But without fear. I understand that cry. Thomas stared at her. The baby screamed again, clutching his suit. Catherine softened her voice. The lights are too bright. The room is loud. Everyone is tense. She nodded toward the child. He feels it. Thomas frowned. My son is not afraid. No, Catherine said quietly. He is absorbing your stress. The words hung in the air. Thomas looked down at the baby. For a moment something flickered in his expression. That a brave helplessness. A crack in the armor. Catherine held out her arms. May I? Gasps rippled through the restaurant. Even the guards looked shocked. Thomas stared at her hands. You're bold, he said. If I drop him, Catherine replied softly, you can fire me. Thomas's eyes hardened. If you drop him, you won't make it out of this building. Then I won't drop him. A long pause followed. The baby wailed again. Finally, Thomas exhaled and handed the child to her. The room froze. Catherine adjusted her posture immediately. She turned slightly away from the chandelier lights, cradled the baby against her shoulder, lowered her voice. Her movements slowed. That gentle, instinctive. She began swaying. Not dramatically, just enough to create rhythm. Hey, she murmured softly. You're okay? The baby hiccuped between cries. She hummed quietly, a low calming tone. The baby's fingers curled into her collar. She rubbed small circles on his back. The screening softened. Guests leaned forward. 10 seconds passed. Then 20. The cry faded into a whimper. The baby sighed and fell asleep. The restaurant erupted into stunned silence. Catherine turned carefully and placed the sleeping child into the stroller beside the table. She tucked the blanket around him. Then she looked at Thomas. He wasn't hungry. Thomas stared at his son. Hey, so. Huh? Finally breathing normally. Huh? He asked. Catherine wiped her hands on the apron. He needed calm. Thomas's eyes lifted to hers. Catherine hesitated, then spoke carefully. He needed a mother. The words landed like thunder. Something raw flashed in Thomas's face. I'm brave. Rage. My wife died, he said quietly. 3 months ago. The restaurant became impossibly quiet. Catherine's voice softened. I'm sorry. Thomas said nothing. He studied her. Her worn shoes. Her tired eyes. Her steady posture. You're a waitress, he said. Yes. And yet you lecture me. I helped a baby. Thomas reached into his jacket. He pulled out a thick stack of cash and dropped it onto the table. Take it. Catherine looked at the money. What? Yes. Her brother's treatment. Everything she needed. She didn't touch it. I didn't do it for money. Thomas's eyebrow lifted. No. I did it because silence would have been wrong. She turned and walked away, leaving the money behind, leaving the most feared man in the city staring after her. And for the first time in years, Thomas Virelli wasn't thinking about power. He was thinking about the waitress who looked him in the eye and told the truth. Catherine's shift ended hours later. The restaurant slowly emptied. Crystal glasses disappeared into trays. Tables were wiped. The soft jazz faded. But the moment from earlier refused to leave Catherine's mind. The crying baby. The look on Thomas Virelli's face when she mentioned a mother. She changed out of her uniform in the cramped staff locker room and pulled on her old coat. Her shoes were worn thin from years of long shifts. When she checked her phone, her stomach sank. 3 missed calls. 2 from the clinic. 1 from her landlord. A text blinked beneath them. Pay tomorrow or get out. Catherine sighed and shoved the phone into her pocket. Just keep moving, she muttered to herself. She exited through the back door into the narrow service alley behind the restaurant. The night air was cold. For a moment she simply leaned against the brick wall and closed her eyes. The city hummed quietly around her. Then a voice spoke from the darkness. Catherine. Her body stiffened. She knew that voice. 3 figures stepped out from behind a dumpster. The man in front grinned. Yellow tee. Baseball bat resting casually on his shoulder. Evening, he said. Vince, Catherine said carefully. Vince the Rat Marino ran small-time loans in the neighborhood. The kind that grew bigger every week. You didn't return my calls, he said. I told you I'd have the money Friday. It is Friday, he replied. Catherine's stomach twisted. My brother. Your brother disappeared, Vince snapped. Which means his $40,000 debt is now yours. Catherine backed toward the wall. I'm paying it. You're paying crumbs, Vince sneered. He stepped closer. Maybe we take payment another way. The other 2 men laughed. Fear ran through her like ice water. Please, she said quietly. Just give me another week. No more weeks. He raised the bat. Then the alley exploded with light. Headlights flooded the narrow street. An engine roared. A massive black SUV screeched to a halt beside him. Before Vince could react, 2 men stepped out. That's professional. Violent. One of them twisted the bat from Vince's hands. The other slammed the thugs against the wall. The attack lasted seconds. Efficient. Silent. Vince ended up face first against the brick, gasping. The back door of the SUV opened slowly. A familiar voice spoke. Explain to me why you're threatening someone who works for me. Catherine froze. Thomas Virelli stepped out of the car. The streetlight caught his face. Oh! Controlled. Powerful. Vince blinked in panic. She owes me money. Thomas ignored him. He walked past the struggling men and stopped in front of Catherine. You're shaking, he observed. I'm fine. Thomas looked behind her. At the men pinned against the wall. Then back to her. You're not fine. He turned to one of his guards. Dominic. Yes, boss. Educate these gentlemen about neighborhood etiquette. Dominic nodded with quiet enthusiasm. Thomas turned back to Catherine. Yet in the car. Her eyes widened. No? Thomas's eyebrow lifted slightly. Excuse me? I appreciate the help, she said, forcing steadiness into her voice. But I'm going home. You don't have a home. Catherine's jaw tightened. That's none of your business. Thomas stepped closer. It becomes my business when people threaten someone who helped my son. He paused, then added calmly. I had someone look into you. Catherine felt exposed. You what? You're 3 months behind on rent. Your brother owes $40,000 to small-time criminals, and your bank account contains $11. She stared at him. That's illegal. No, Thomas said quietly. It's efficient. He gestured toward the SUV. I had a problem. And I'm supposed to care? You're the solution. Catherine laughed bitterly. I'm a waitress. Not anymore. Thomas leaned slightly closer. My son hasn't slept more than 2 hours at a time since his mother died. He paused. But tonight he slept through dinner. Her anger softened slightly. Tuh. So I'm offering you a job. Catherine folded her arms. What kind of job? Live-in nanny. Her eyes widened. No. Thomas didn't seem surprised. You will live in my estate. No. You will care for Leo. No. I will pay off your debt tonight. She hesitated. $5,000 a week. The number hung in the cold air. Life-changing money. Freedom money. Catherine looked past him. Dominic was calmly wiping blood off his knuckles. Vince lay groaning on the ground. The world she lived in suddenly felt very small. She looked back at Thomas. And what's the catch? Thomas answered without hesitation. You live under my roof. And your business? You don't ask. And you don't involve me. Correct. She hesitated. And you never touch me. Thomas looked almost amused. I have plenty of women who want my attention. That? Silence stretched between them. Then Catherine asked quietly. My brother. Thomas tilted his head. What about him? You find him. You get him into a real rehab center. Thomas nodded once. Catherine looked at the open SUV door, then at the dark alley, then at the sleeping baby she imagined inside that mansion. Finally, she exhaled. Fine. Thomas smiled slightly. A dangerous smile. Get in the car, Catherine. As she climbed inside, she realized something. Her life as she knew it was over, and the war she was about to step into had already begun. The drive lasted nearly 40 minutes. At first, the city lights surrounded them, neon signs, traffic, crowded streets. Then the buildings thinned. The roads widened. Trees began to appear. Catherine sat in the back seat of the armored SUV, as far from Thomas as possible. Between them sat Leo's car seat. The baby was still sleeping peacefully, one tiny fist curled under his chin. Thomas hadn't spoken much during the drive. Neither had she. But silence with Thomas Virelli felt heavier than conversation. Finally, the car turned onto a long private road. Iron gates rose ahead. What? Covered in security cameras. The gates opened automatically. Beyond them stood a massive estate. Stone walls. Long curved driveway. Armed guards patrolling the grounds with trained dogs. It didn't look like a home. It looked like a fortress pretending to be a mansion. The SUV stopped beneath towering oak doors. Servants waited outside as if they had been standing there all night. Catherine stepped out carefully, holding Leo. The house loomed above her. Beautiful. Welcome, Thomas said quietly, to my world. Before she could respond, a slow clap echoed from the front steps. Well. A man leaned against a marble column, smoking a cigarette. He was younger than Thomas. Maybe early 30s. Sharp suit. Perfect hair. But unlike Thomas's controlled presence, this man carried something else. Argus. Cruel amusement. And this must be the miracle worker, he said. Thomas's jaw tightened. Marco. The man flicked hash onto the stone floor. Relax, brother, I'm curious. Marco's eyes slid over Catherine. Slowly. Shut. Not bad, he said with a smirk. A little thin, but. She is staff, Thomas interrupted coldly. Off limits. Marco laughed. Of course she is. He stepped closer, looking at the baby in her arms. So this is the famous heir. Leo stirred slightly but remained asleep. Marco's smile twisted. The kid looks peaceful. Thomas's voice dropped lower. Put the cigarette out. Marco took one last drag, exhaled toward the night sky, and crushed it beneath his expensive shoe. Then he leaned closer to Catherine. I'm Marco Virelli, he said. The fun uncle. Catherine nodded politely. Catherine. Marco tilted his head. A waitress who tells my brother how to raise his child. His grin widened. You must be very brave. Or very stupid, Thomas said. Marco chuckled. I like her already. Thomas turned to Catherine. Take Leo upstairs. Mrs. Grayson will show you your room. An older woman appeared beside them like a shadow. Edrek. Housekeeper energy carved into her bones. This way. Catherine followed her inside. The mansion's interior was breathtaking. Marble floors. Massive chandeliers. Paintings that probably cost more than entire buildings. But something felt wrong. The place was too quiet. Too perfect. Too empty. As they climbed the grand staircase, voices erupted downstairs. Marco's voice. Edri, you brought a stranger into the house during a crisis. Thomas's reply came colder. My son needed help. We have problems bigger than a crying baby. The baby is the future of this family. Marco scoffed. You're getting soft. Silence followed. Then a loud crash. Catherine froze on the stairs. Mrs. Grayson didn't react. She simply continued walking. Family discussions, the housekeeper said dryly. The nursery upstairs was enormous. Toys lined the walls. Plush animals. What? A crib carved from polished oak. But the room looked and touched like it had been prepared and then abandoned. Catherine gently laid Leo in the crib. He stirred slightly. His eyes opened. Dark. Curious. Confused. Hey there, Catherine whispered softly. She stroked his hair. I'm Catherine. Leo blinked at her, then grabbed her finger. She smiled. You're not alone anymore. Outside the window, guards walked the perimeter with rifles. The mansion lights cast long shadows across the lawn. Catherine suddenly understood something. She hadn't escaped danger. She had walked straight into it. 3 weeks passed. And slowly, the mansion began to change. It started with small things. A lullaby drifting through the hallways. The scent of baby powder replacing cigar smoke. Colorful toys scattered across marble floors. Catherine built routines. Morning walks in the secured gardens. Feeding schedules. Mat time. Nap time. Leo began sleeping through the night. Something he hadn't done since his mother died. Thomas noticed. He didn't say much, but he noticed. Sometimes Catherine would see him standing quietly in the doorway of the nursery late at night. Watching. Not speaking. Just listening to the calm. But not everyone was pleased. Marco watched Catherine like a hawk. From balconies. From hallways. From the far end of dinner tables. His smile never reached his eyes. One rainy afternoon, Catherine went downstairs to prepare Leo's formula. The house was strangely empty. Most of the staff had been dismissed early. Marco's idea. Security inspection, someone had said. But the excuse felt wrong. As Catherine prepared the bottle, she heard a noise. Paper shuffling. From Thomas's office. The door was slightly open. It was never open. Catherine knew the rule. Stay out of the office. But the noise continued. Curiosity tugged at her. She stepped closer. Peered through the gap. Marco stood behind Thomas's desk. Drawers open. Documents scattered. His phone snapped photos rapidly. Then he opened a hidden safe behind a painting. Inside sat a black leather ledger. Marco grinned. Finally, he slipped the book into his jacket. Checkmate, brother. Catherine's breath caught. Her sneaker squeaked against the marble floor. Marco's head snapped toward the door. Who's there? Catherine ran. Her heart pounded. She sprinted toward the staircase. Catherine! Marco's voice thundered through the hall. She reached the stairs, but a hand grabbed her arm. Hud. Marco spun her around and slammed her against the banister. What did you see? He hissed. Not there. You're lying. His grip tightened. You're spying for him. I'm a nanny. Marco laughed darkly. You think you're innocent in this house? He leaned closer. You just walked into a war. His hand slid toward her throat. I could snap your neck and tell everyone you fell. A calm voice echoed from the entrance hall. Try. Marco froze. Slow footsteps climbed the staircase. Thomas appeared at the bottom. Rain dripped from his coat. Dominic stood behind him holding a shotgun. Thomas looked at Catherine's bruised arm, then at Marco, and his eyes turned black with fury. The wolves had finally turned on each other, and Catherine stood in the middle of the battlefield. Thomas climbed the stairs slowly. Each step carried the quiet weight of a storm. Marco released Catherine's arm, but not because he wanted to. Because he had to. Thomas stopped at the top of the staircase. Rain still clung to the shoulders of his coat. His eyes dropped to Catherine's arm. Red fingerprints were forming where Marco had grabbed her. Thomas's jaw tightened. Explain, he said quietly. Marco raised his hands with fake innocence. She was snooping. I was making Leo's bottle, Catherine said quickly. Marco scoffed. She was outside your office. Thomas's gaze shifted between them. What did you see? He asked Catherine. Before she could answer, Marco cut in. She's lying. Thomas turned his head slightly. Marco. The name sounded less like a greeting, and more like a warning. Marco smirked. You're choosing a waitress over your own brother? Thomas stepped closer. His voice dropped to something cold and final. I told you she was off limits. Marco rolled his eyes. Oh please, Enzo. Crack. Thomas's fist connected with Marco's jaw so hard the sound echoed through the mansion. Marco collapsed onto the floor. Blood touched the marble. The entire house went silent. Marco laughed weakly as he pushed himself up. You're losing control. Thomas stood over him. No, he said quietly. I'm gaining clarity. Marco wiped blood from his lip. The other families already think you're weak. You broke into my office. Marco's eyes flashed. So what if I did? Thomas stepped forward again. Get out. Marco blinked. What? Get out of my house. Marco stood slowly. You're serious? If I see you here again, Thomas said calmly, I will treat you like any other traitor. The word hung heavy. Traitor. Marco's smile disappeared. His gaze shifted toward Catherine. Pure hatred burned there. This isn't over, he said softly. Then he turned and walked out. The mansion doors slammed. Silence returned. But this time it felt dangerous. Thomas looked at Catherine. Are you hurt? She shook her head. He took something from your safe. Thomas froze. What? A black ledger. Thomas's face drained of color. For the first time since she had met him, Catherine saw fear. The ledger, he whispered. Dominic cursed quietly behind him. That book has everything. What does it mean? Catherine asked. Thomas turned away, pacing. It means Marco now holds the keys to every deal I've ever made. And he'll sell it. To who? Thomas stopped walking. One man. He spoke the name like it tasted bitter. Sergei Volkov. Dominic exhaled heavily. That Russian butcher. Catherine crossed her arms. And what happens if Volkov gets the ledger? Thomas looked at her directly. What? The mansion transformed overnight. Security doubled. Guards patrolled every hallway. Weapons appeared in places Catherine never expected. Hidden compartments. Locked cabinets. Even behind paintings. The calm life she had built with Leo vanished instantly. Thomas barely slept. Dominic coordinated patrols. Phone calls echoed through the house at all hours. Catherine focused on Leo. Because babies didn't care about wars. Leo still needed bottles. Still needed lullabies. Still needed someone calm. And strangely, Thomas began appearing in the nursery more often. One night he stood silently near the crib, watching Leo sleep. You should rest, Catherine told him softly. Thomas shook his head. Too many problems. Problems don't get solved by staring at a baby. Thomas looked at her. Actually, sometimes they do. She raised an eyebrow. When I watch him, Thomas said quietly, I remember why I fight. The honesty surprised her. Then the alarm screamed. Red lights flashed through the hallway. Dominic's voice roared through the intercom. Locked on. Thomas's head snapped toward the door. Already? Gunfire erupted somewhere downstairs. Catherine grabbed Leo instinctively. What's happening? Thomas pulled a pistol from a drawer. Barely. Another burst of gunfire echoed. Glass shattered. Dominic shouted again. They're inside. Catherine's heart pounded. Thomas turned to her. Take Leo to the panic room. She ran toward the library. Behind a bookshelf sat a hidden door. She pressed the security panel. Nothing happened. Thomas. He appeared beside her seconds later. What? The panic room isn't opening. Thomas slammed the keypad. It's been disabled. Marco. Of course. Heavy footsteps thundered in the hallway. Voices shouting in Russian. Catherine clutched Leo tighter. What do we do? Thomas thought quickly. Then reached into his pocket and pulled out a small key. There's a service tunnel in the wine cellar. He pressed the key into her hand. It leads outside the estate. Her eyes widened. You're coming too. No. You have to go. More gunshots echoed. Closer now. He grabbed her shoulders. You are the only person I trust with him. Leo began crying. Terrified. Thomas kissed the baby's forehead. Then he looked at Catherine. For a moment the Mafia boss disappeared. Only a desperate father remained. Please, he said quietly. Say my son. Before she could respond, he pushed her toward the cellar door and turned back toward the gunfire. Catherine ran through the kitchen, down the stone steps, into the cold wine cellar. She found the hidden tunnel entrance behind a rack of dusty bottles. The passage was narrow, dark. Cobwebs clung to the walls. She crawled forward, holding Leo close. The gunfire above grew distant. Minutes felt like hours. Finally, she saw moonlight ahead. The tunnel opened into the woods beyond the estate wall. Catherine stumbled outside. Fresh air filled her lungs. A small shed stood nearby. A car waited exactly where Thomas had said. She ran toward it. Then a voice echoed from the shadows. Well done, Nanny. Catherine froze. Marco stepped out from behind the shed, holding a pistol. I knew he'd send you this way. Leo cried harder. Marco smiled. Put the baby down. Catherine's heart pounded. He's your nephew. Marco shrugged. He is an obstacle. The gun lifted toward her chest. Hand him over. Catherine looked at the gun. Looked at Leo. Then at Marco. And something inside her changed. She slowly knelt. Okay, she said softly. Marco smirked. That's a good girl. Her hand brushed the ground. Her fingers closed around a heavy rock. She stood suddenly and hurled it with everything she had. The rock smashed into Marco's forehead. His gun fired wildly into the air. Marco staggered backward. Catherine charged him. She kicked the pistol into the grass. Marco roared and tackled her. They crashed to the ground. His hands grabbed her throat. I'll kill you. Catherine clawed his face. Bit his wrists. Fought like a wild animal. But Marco was stronger. His grip tightened. Darkness crept into her vision. That? Marco's body jerked. Another shot echoed. Marco collapsed. Catherine pushed him off. Gasping. At the edge of the trees stood Thomas Virelli, supported by Dominic. Smoke curled from Thomas's pistol. He looked down at Marco's body, then at Catherine. I told him, Thomas whispered, to stay away from you. The war had just claimed its first blood, and Catherine Hale was no longer just a waitress. Sirens echoed through the forest minutes later. But these were not ordinary police. They were the kind that arrived when Thomas Virelli made a phone call. Marco's body disappeared before sunrise. The official report would later describe the night as a failed armed robbery by foreign criminals. No one mentioned betrayal. No one mentioned family. And no one mentioned the waitress who nearly died protecting a child. Thomas collapsed before they even reached the mansion. The bullet in his shoulder had torn through muscle. Another had grazed his thigh. Dominic and two guards carried him through the doors like soldiers bringing home a wounded king. The west wing of the mansion transformed into a private hospital overnight. Doctors arrived quietly. Medical equipment filled the bedroom. But Catherine refused to leave the room. Not once. She sat in a chair beside the bed with Leo asleep against her chest. Dominic watched her carefully. You saved him tonight, he finally said. Catherine shook her head. I saved the baby. Dominic smirked. Same thing. Thomas woke nearly 12 hours later. The room was quiet. Morning sunlight filtered through the curtains. The first thing he saw was Leo sleeping beside him. The second thing he saw was Catherine. Still sitting there. Still awake. You didn't leave, he said weakly. Catherine folded her arms. You asked me to save your son. Thomas studied her. Then his gaze moved to the bruises on her throat. Marco did that. He tried. Thomas closed his eyes briefly. That. Thomas exhaled slowly. For a moment the room felt lighter. But then reality returned. Volkov still lives. Catherine nodded. Yes. And he now believes you're weak. Yes. Thomas stared at the ceiling. That means he will move. Dominic leaned against the doorway. He already has. Thomas turned his head. That's plain. Dominic crossed his arms. Volkov scheduled a summit. But who? Every smaller crime family in the city. Thomas's jaw tightened. He's claiming your territory. And he expects me to hide. Dominic nodded. That's exactly what he wants. Catherine spoke quietly. Then don't hide. Both men looked at her. She stood slowly and walked toward the large map table in the room. The city map spread across it like a battlefield. Where is the meeting? He asked. Dominic pointed. A warehouse in the old shipping district. Catherine studied it. Then she asked something unexpected. Who owns the building? Thomas frowned. A shell company tied to my shipping docks. Catherine smiled faintly. So technically you own it. Dominic blinked. Well, yes. She tapped the map. And the gas lines beneath the district. Thomas's eyes narrowed. You're thinking something dangerous. I'm thinking something smart. Dominic leaned closer. What exactly are you suggesting? Catherine folded her arms. Volkov believes you're too injured to fight. Thomas nodded slowly. That's correct. So instead of attacking him, she paused. Invite him to crown himself. Silence filled the room. Thomas understood first. His eyes darkened. You're proposing a trap. Catherine nodded. Let the summit happen. Dominic slowly began smiling. And removed the floor beneath them. Thomas looked at Catherine carefully. You're very calm about destroying a warehouse full of criminals. She shrugged. They came to kill your son. That answer ended the discussion. Thomas leaned back in his bed. Dominic. Yes, boss. Prepare demolition. Dominic grinned. With pleasure. 3 weeks later the plan was ready. Thomas could walk again, though the cane remained in his hand. The city believed he was dying. Volkov believed the throne was his. The summit night arrived quietly. Catherine sat with Thomas in the study. Leo slept upstairs. A police scanner crackled on the desk. Neither of them spoke. Finally Thomas asked softly, Why didn't you leave? She looked at him. You offered me millions. Ness. And safety. Ness. So why stay? Catherine thought for a moment. Then answered honestly. Because Leo needed someone. Thomas studied her face. And that? You needed someone who wasn't afraid of you. The scanner suddenly exploded with static. Then voices. Where's it? Massive explosion reported in District 4. Structural collapse at shipping warehouse. Multiple fires spreading. Thomas closed his eyes slowly. The trap had worked. Minutes later a burner phone rang. Dominic's voice came through. It's done, boss. Thomas said nothing. Volkov was inside. Dominic continued. The entire summit. And our men? Already clear. Thomas hung up the phone. The war was over. Just like that. But instead of celebration, he felt something unexpected. Exhaustion. Thomas leaned forward and buried his face in his hands. Catherine walked over quietly. She didn't say anything. She simply pulled his hands away and gently rested his head against her shoulder. For the first time in years, Thomas Virelli allowed himself to breathe. You saved everything, he murmured. Catherine shook her head. No. She looked toward the nursery upstairs. We saved him. Thomas's voice softened. You changed this house. No. I changed you. Thomas smiled faintly. And the most dangerous man in the city needed a waitress to do it. Catherine laughed quietly. Sometimes power needs someone who tells the truth. Thomas looked at her differently then. Not as an employee, not as a servant, but as something far more powerful. An ape-wall. And he knew something else. The woman who had walked into a restaurant and silenced a crying baby had just ended a Mafia war. War leaves echoes. Even when the gunfire stops. Even when the enemies disappear. For weeks after the explosion that ended Sergei Volkov's empire, the Virelli estate felt strangely quiet. Too quiet. The guards were still there. Security cameras still watched every corner. But the tension that once filled the halls had faded. Something else had taken its place. Life. It started with Leo. The child who once cried through every night now laughed constantly. His footsteps, small, clumsy, determined, became the loudest sound in the mansion. And Thomas noticed something. Leo didn't run toward the guards. He didn't run toward the servants. He ran toward Catherine. Every time. One warm afternoon, Catherine sat on a blanket in the garden while Leo played with a golden retriever puppy she had insisted the house needed. Thomas stood nearby watching them. For years he had ruled the city with fear. Yet this simple scene felt more powerful than any throne he had ever held. Leo stumbled toward him suddenly. "That!" Thomas froze. The word hit him harder than any bullet ever had. "That!" Leo grabbed his leg and pointed excitedly at the puppy. "David!" Thomas slowly crouched down and picked him up. "That's right," he murmured. "And Dar." Leo patted his cheek proudly. Catherine watched from the blanket, smiling. "Looks like someone finally figured out the word father." Thomas looked at her. His expression softened in a way very few people had ever seen. "You did that." "I didn't." "You taught him to trust." Catherine shrugged. "Children don't trust power. They trust kindness." Thomas looked down at Leo again. Then something inside him shifted. For years he had believed power came from control. From fear. From domination. But Catherine had proven something different. Power could kneel. Power could change. And power could choose peace. That evening Thomas asked Catherine to meet him in the garden again. The sun was setting. The sky burned with gold and purple. Leo slept inside the house. Dominic watched from the porch like a quiet guardian. Thomas stood beside the stone fountain when Catherine arrived. "You wanted to talk?" He nodded. "I've been thinking. That's dangerous." He smiled slightly. "Dominic says the same thing." Catherine folded her arms. "So what's troubling the king of the city?" Thomas looked out across the garden walls. "Everything is quiet now." "That's good." "It's unfamiliar." She nodded slowly. "You've spent your entire life fighting." "Yes. And now you don't know who you are without enemies." Thomas turned toward her. "Exactly." Catherine sat on the stone bench. "Then figure it out." Thomas sat beside her. "I started already." "Oh." "I moved most of my business into legitimate companies." Catherine raised an eyebrow. "Real estate, shipping, technology investments." "That sounds boring." Thomas smiled faintly. "I want boring." He paused. "I want my biggest worry to be Leo's school grades." Catherine laughed softly. "That's a big promotion from Mafia boss." Thomas grew serious. "Catherine." She looked at him. For a moment he struggled for words. The powerful man who commanded armies suddenly looked uncertain. "I never asked you to stay." She nodded. "You did it. You could have taken the money and left." "Yes. That you stay." She looked toward the mansion. Toward the nursery window where Leo slept. He needed someone. Thomas studied her carefully. "And then?" "You needed someone who wouldn't fear you." He reached slowly into his coat pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Catherine blinked. "Thomas, let me finish." He opened the box. Inside sat a delicate gold ring set with a deep blue sapphire. Not large, but elegant. "This belonged to my grandmother," he said. "She was the only woman my grandfather ever feared." Catherine looked at the ring, then at him. I don't want a queen, Thomas said quietly. I want the woman who walked into a restaurant and told me the truth. His voice softened. Marry me. Catherine's breath caught. Not because of the ring. Not because of the power he offered. But because Thomas Virelli, the most feared man in the city, looked at her like a man asking for permission to breathe. She glanced toward the porch. Dominic pretended not to watch. Then she looked toward the house, where Leo slept peacefully. Then back at Thomas. You understand something? She said quietly. Tell me. I didn't stay because you're powerful. I know. I stayed because Leo needed a family. Thomas nodded slowly. And you gave him one. Catherine smiled. And families are built on choices. Thomas held out the ring. So what is your choice? She took the ring. For a moment she simply held it. Then she slipped it onto her finger. Yes. Thomas exhaled slowly. Relief. Gratitude. Something deeper than victory. He didn't kiss her immediately. Instead, he pressed his forehead against hers. A quiet surrender. The king kneeling to truth. From the porch, Dominic muttered to himself. About time. The sun slipped below the horizon. The estate lights flickered on. And somewhere inside the house, Leo woke up. His small voice echoed through the open window. Ah! Catherine laughed softly. Well, she said. Looks like someone already made the decision for us. Thomas smiled. For the first time in years, the most powerful man in the city felt something greater than power. This reflection. Sometimes the world believes power belongs to the loudest voice, the strongest fists, or the richest man in the room. But real power often walks quietly. It wears simple uniforms. It works long hours. And it speaks only when silence would be wrong. Catherine never chased power. She only chose truth. And in doing so, she changed a crying child, a broken father, and an entire empire. Because sometimes the greatest strength is not ruling the world. Sometimes, the greatest strength is teaching it how to love. If this story moved you, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories like this. And tell me in the comments what would you have done in Catherine's place.